She thought she was removing a problem. She had no idea she was handing me the microphone, in front of the very people I didn't need to explain myself to. I arrived at 7:46. The elevator smelled like oversteeped coffee and expensive panic. On 38th, the air always felt colder, cleaner, as if the floor itself resented warmth, kindness, or hesitation. I stepped into the executive hallway, heels soft against the gray carpet, a silence so tight it felt wired for sound. Jenna at the reception blinked once when she saw me. She glanced at the CEO's glass-walled office, then back at me. He's in. Of course he was. The CEO, Andrew Carradine, had always been early, not to work, to war. He was the kind of man who sat like a manila folder, beige, flat, dangerous in bulk. You never saw him coming because you never thought anything that bland could burn you. But I'd known better. He didn't look up when I entered, just motioned to the chair. There was a single sheet of paper waiting. Your time here has been appreciated. His voice was buttered glass, smooth, cold, sharp at the corners. No eye contact, not even fake sympathy. I'm letting you go effective immediately. I didn't ask why, because I knew why, because he didn't think I knew what he'd done. I smiled. Not a sweet smile, not a polite one. A quiet, amused, terrifying smile, the kind that makes people check the floor beneath them. Of course, I said, let's do this properly. He blinked, just once, as if something hadn't gone according to script. I took the pen and signed. One signature, one smile, one sharp inhale. Then I placed the pen back down, precisely aligned with the edge of his desk, and stood. I'll see you in 14 minutes, I said, and walked out. 7:54 a.m., back in my office. For now, I locked the door. The air was still, but inside, the wires had started humming. I opened the safe. Not metaphorically, an actual silent biometric drawer installed under the credenza. Inside was a red folder labeled Ownership Percent, Control Structure, Emergency Clauses. Andrew had never once asked me about my holdings, never questioned the silent Class B share conversions from 7 years ago, the trust restructuring, or the voting proxy adjustments tied to my LLC, because Andrew didn't look down when he climbed. He only looked up, at himself. And now he was standing on a floor I built. I slipped the folder into my bag, closed the safe, and checked the time. 8:07, 10 minutes. Enough. I walked past HR, they didn't dare meet my eyes. Past legal, too quiet. Past Jenna, whose jaw was ever so slightly ajar. The boardroom door was open. The lights were on. The leather chairs looked like thrones waiting for a funeral. Andrew was already inside, mid-sentence. He didn't see me. Not yet. But the chair of the audit committee did. So did Priya, the youngest board member and the only one who'd ever asked about share classes. They watched me take the last empty seat. And then they watched Andrew realize I was here. He stopped talking, not because he was surprised, but because he knew, in some deep, primal corner of his spine, that he'd made a very expensive mistake. You'll want to see what happened when I spoke first, and what I brought with me. 8:10 a.m. The room hadn't breathed since I sat down. Andrew cleared his throat. Loud, rehearsed, defensive. The chairman gave him a slow glance, the kind a headmaster gives a student right before a suspension. Let's begin, Andrew said, reaching for control, literal and symbolic, of the meeting's agenda. But his hands paused, because the screen behind him had changed. Before we do, I said, I'd like to exercise my voting rights. Silence. Then movement, fast and confused, as eyes darted to the agenda packet. Andrew's mouth twitched. You're no longer employed by the company, he said, voice tight. I nodded. Correct. Which is why I'm attending as majority shareholder. And slid a new folder down the table. One by one, they reached for it, flipped the cover, scanned the page. Their faces didn't change, not obviously, but the air did. He looked at me now, finally, but too late. You don't own 85%. I let the silence stretch like piano wire. Not directly, but I do control it, through proxies, Class B conversions, and cross-linked voting trusts, which, as of last week, reached final execution. Andrew looked at the general counsel, but she wasn't blinking. She's right, the chair said flatly. Her control exceeds 85%. She has full voting rights today. Andrew didn't sit. He fell into the chair like the air had turned to stone. 8:12 a.m. I stood. You all know me. I've worked here for 14 years. I've built teams, products, and margins that didn't exist when we started. Pause. No reaction. But I could see heads nodding internally. You've seen the growth. Another pause. You've also seen the change, the shift in tone in how this place treats risk, dissent, and its own people. I took a breath. Not because I needed it, but because they did. I have not come here to take over. I came to restore what's been buried under quarterly performance and fragile ego. I glanced at Andrew. He didn't move. I have 5 motions to propose, all within my voting rights, all effective immediately. 1. Removal of Andrew Carradine as CEO, pending transition. 2. Appointment of an interim CEO with financial neutrality. 3. Review and publication of internal audit reports suppressed last year. 4. Freeze on executive bonuses pending restructuring. 5. Resumption of the ethics investigation halted under Andrew's directive. The room was frozen, but no one stopped me. Let's vote. 8:15 a.m. the votes came in, one by one, digital, logged, unanimous. Even Andrew didn't vote. He just stared, at me, at the screen, at the unraveling of everything he thought untouchable. The board secretary confirmed the results. It's done, the chair said quietly. Andrew opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. No title, no power, no floor under him. 8:17 a.m. the moment the final vote logged, I sat again. Calm, grounded, quiet, and that's when everyone looked at me, not as a VP, not even as an opponent, but as the one who now held the reins, and just when they thought it was over, they found out what else I had planned. If that power shift stunned you, wait until you see what she does with it. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next move. 20M. The room hadn't moved. Papers stayed untouched. Fingers hovered over tablets but didn't scroll. No one dared sip coffee. Not even the chair creaked. Andrew, dethroned but still breathing the rarefied air of power, remained seated. His shoulders slouched in a way that made the expensive fabric of his blazer look cheaper. He looked like a man trying to wake up from a dream that someone else was writing. But I didn't move either, because the room already had. Shifted, not physically, but in weight, in direction, and all of it was now tilted toward me. The interim CEO stood. Elena Morales, former CFO, neutral, respected, feared for her surgical mind and complete lack of drama. She nodded once in my direction, then addressed the room with her usual lethal calm. I'll be coordinating transition protocols and reporting structures, effective now. Her tone made it clear. This was no negotiation. This was execution. Andrew blinked rapidly. You planned this, he said softly. Not an accusation, a realization. I turned to him slowly. I planned to protect the company, I replied. What happened to you along the way was your own doing. He flinched, not because of the words, but because I didn't raise my voice to say them. 8:24 a.m. Elena continued outlining the shift. Voting rights realigned, control shift mechanisms activated. My ownership percentage, long silent in its influence, was now fully vocal. I'd like the minutes of this meeting notarized, I said, standing again. The board secretary nodded, typing furiously. I placed an envelope on the table. Inside, a timeline, emails, messages, a list of decisions Andrew made that violated both policy and basic decency. Not illegal, not all of it, but unethical enough to leave scars. This isn't about revenge, I said clearly, letting the silence hold it. This is about preventing collapse, about rebuilding something we once believed in. One of the board members, Michael, a quiet lion who rarely spoke, leaned forward. You're not planning to stay forever, are you? I met his gaze. No, just long enough to fix what's broken. He nodded once. The chair smiled, faint but real. You may want to look into restructuring HR next, she said with dry humor. They seem out of sync. I smiled. Already underway. 8:27 a.m., Andrew finally stood. His mouth opened, closed. He reached for his briefcase like a man collecting memories instead of plans. He paused by the door. I underestimated you. I didn't smile. No, I said. You miscalculated ownership. He left without looking back. That was his final mistake. 8:30 a.m., the meeting officially adjourned. The room emptied slowly, quietly, like a cathedral after confession. I stayed behind just for a moment, breathing in the space that had once been his. The leather still smelled like control, but now it was mine. I ran a hand along the polished oak. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration, and I had more work to do. 6 a.m., I was back in my office, or rather, the office I hadn't officially lost. Not even for 20 minutes. The nameplate on the door still read, VP Strategic Operations. But everything inside had already shifted. The energy was different. Not louder, just clearer. Like a storm had passed, and the air could finally breathe again. On the desk, 3 screens, 2 folders. One message from legal blinking. Action required. Formal board resolution and statement to staff. I didn't hesitate. Typed, reviewed, authorized. At 9:11 a.m., every employee received an email. Header: Leadership realignment, immediate stabilization plan. No drama, no vendetta, no details about Andrew, just clarity, reassurance, momentum. The response wasn't silence. It was applause, not the loud kind, the kind typed in Slack, in emojis, in the absence of fear. 9:17 a.m., Elena walked in without knocking. It says Andrew tried accessing internal files just now from his personal tablet. I raised an eyebrow. And? They've already revoked credentials, VPN access, and disabled all trace routes. But you should know, he downloaded something before that. I didn't flinch, because I knew exactly what he took. The original executive comp structure, including a clause he'd buried years ago. A clause I had quietly reactivated through board approval 3 quarters back. It stated, any officer removed due to ethics-related vote forfeits severance. Meaning, no golden parachute, no PR-crafted exit, just air, and I knew Andrew. He'd try to spin it anyway. I turned to Elena. Monitor, but don't block him. Let him act. He'll step into his own shadow soon enough. 10:03 a.m. HR knocked, this time asking permission. How would you like to handle the internal announcement? I stood, walked to the window. The skyline blinked below. Towers that once intimidated me now looked like chess pieces on a smaller board. I'll go floor by floor, I said. In person. They stared. It's just, we've never had leadership do that. Exactly, I said. 10:32 a.m., the 23rd floor had never seen me before. Not really, just emails, names in org charts. But now I stood among them, explaining what was changing, how they mattered, and what would never be tolerated again. The floor manager, a man who once said, "We don't get involved," actually asked a question, a good one. And when I finished, the applause wasn't performative. It was permission, granted back to themselves. But not everyone clapped. One person slipped away during the speech. Quiet, intentional, someone loyal to Andrew, and I knew exactly where they were going. 11 a.m. Back in my office, my assistant handed me a sealed envelope. No label, just weight. Inside, a printout. Andrew's resignation letter, forged. Signed with my name, time-stamped 8:05 a.m. My hands didn't shake, because this was his final play. And I had already placed the board camera footage in secure chain of custody at 8:18. Next step, General Counsel. I picked up the phone. Activate the clause, notify internal audit, and log this under policy code 9.4, attempted fabrication post-termination. Let. 12 a.m., the copy of the forged resignation sat on the table between me and General Counsel. It didn't scream, it didn't bleed, it was just paper. But paper can be a weapon, especially when someone assumes it'll never see the light. I already cross-verified the timestamp, Julia said, flipping through her tablet. It doesn't match any known print job from your workstation or credentials, but it does match the signature style from Andrew's onboarding doc from 2014. She tapped once, enlarging the slant of the loop in the letter R in my last name. I leaned in. That's enough to proceed? She nodded. It's not just falsification. It's a post-termination forgery with the intent to destabilize an executive transition. That activates Control Protocol 12.2. The one clause Andrew had buried in the old policy binder, thinking no one read that far, except I had. And I'd left it in place, untouched, just in case. 11:30 a.m. legal escalated, internal audit confirmed. Cybersecurity backed the access logs. 3 departments, 0 errors, full documentation. I walked into the compliance wing, a place most execs avoided like a dentist's office. The director of ethics, an ex-prosecutor named Dane, met me with a raised eyebrow. "Paper's clean, but the intent isn't," he said after 5 minutes of review. "He was trying to use your name to trigger a power vacuum, get the board to panic, question your standing." I nodded. "But the board saw the real version, and the camera footage shows the exact moment you didn't sign anything but the HR document. Time-stamped. Audio verified." He grinned. "It's like watching someone jump into a pool with no water." Still, I knew Andrew wouldn't stop here. He didn't know how to lose quietly. 12 hours p.m., the office of the chair scheduled a closed session. 12 board members, 1 empty seat. Mine. They didn't need me to explain. They needed to vote. Result? Vote to formally initiate litigation against Andrew Carradine for breach of fiduciary responsibility and attempted executive interference. Passed. Vote to notify external counsel and PR in advance. Passed. Vote to preserve all digital evidence and hard copies. Passed. I didn't celebrate, because real leadership doesn't spike the ball, it resets the field. Still, as I returned to my office, I saw a message from facilities. Security escort requested. Former executive attempting re-entry via loading dock. 12:09 p.m. I walked, not ran, down 2 flights, into the concrete echo of the service corridor. Andrew stood near the industrial elevator, talking fast to a junior-level admin from logistics. Poor girl looked pale. They'll realize the mistake once they read the statement. I stepped into view. She nearly jumped. Andrew turned. His voice dropped. "You don't have to do this." I smiled, the same quiet smile from 8:03. I already did. Behind me, 2 uniformed security officers arrived, calm, professional, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Carradine, you've been formally flagged under Code 9.4. You are no longer permitted on this property. This is your notice of trespass. You'll receive written confirmation shortly." He looked at me, searching for weakness, but I had none left to give him. As they walked him out, not handcuffed but with dignity he didn't deserve, I remained standing in the concrete stillness. It wasn't revenge. It was removal, surgical, clean, documented, and the company? It had finally begun to heal. 30 through. p.m., the air felt lighter, not because anything physical had changed, but because everything else had. It's strange how a building can feel sick, even when it's made of steel and glass. For months, there had been something rotten in the walls. You could sense it in how people walked, avoided eye contact, clutched their phones like shields. Now, it was like someone had opened a window, and I could breathe. In the main conference hall, preparations were underway for a staff-wide live stream, the first in company history where transparency wasn't a slogan. It was the point. I stood behind the curtain, watching engineers plug in cables, double-check audio feeds, and joke like human beings again. And just before going live, I got a message from an unexpected name. "Priya, look what I found." 1:39 p.m. Priya, youngest board member, strategic mind, precise. She'd been digging through archived voting logs from 5 years back, looking for precedent around succession planning. She'd found an anomaly. A proxy signature, authorized during a rushed vote to grant Andrew interim executive privileges, had been registered to a shell entity. The signature? Identical to one recently submitted by the same entity. Against me. "He's been trying to sabotage your control since before last year," she wrote, "and it started during that acquisition meeting you flagged." I stared at the screen. Andrew hadn't just tried to remove me today. He'd been trying to dilute my influence through corporate shadows for over a year. But his mistake? He never thought I'd stay this long. He thought I'd walk away, that I was temporary. A stepping stone. Instead, I'd built roots beneath the concrete, and now I had the paperwork to trace every inch of his sabotage. 1:44 p.m., the live stream began. I stood center stage, no teleprompter, no handlers, just me. A microphone, and a room full of employees watching from every screen in the company. I told them what mattered. That leadership had shifted. That integrity was no longer optional. That fear was no longer a management tool. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. Truth had weight, and it carried itself. I saw eyes fill with relief, some even with pride, and for the first time in months, I saw people smile without checking who was watching. But I still had one more move. 2:10 p.m. Back in the boardroom, I signed the release documents with General Counsel. Official transfer of executive power, not symbolic, not interim, not acting. Final. Elena would take over full-time as CEO in 90 days. I'd step back into silent ownership. No titles, no ego, just control. Real control. The kind built on structure, trust, and deep, patient planning. At the bottom of the form, there was a question. Preferred title going forward? I paused, then wrote, Founder of the Fix. Because that's what this was. Not a takeover, not revenge, a correction, and it was complete. 4:45 p.m., I walked the long hallway to the archive room, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see what had been ignored. This part of the building never changed. No glass walls, no espresso machines, just paper, dust, and corporate memory. It was here that Andrew's version of leadership had left the deepest marks. Old expense records, rewritten policies, meeting minutes edited 2 days after the actual calls. I slid open the metal drawer labeled Board Adjustments 2016-2020, and there it was. A meeting transcript marked confidential, not for distribution. One paragraph stood out. It's fine. She doesn't want power. She builds. She doesn't play the game. I smiled, not because it was wrong, but because it used to be right. They mistook quiet for weakness. That was their first error. 3:10 p.m., I met with the ethics committee and now fully reactivated. We didn't talk about Andrew. We talked about prevention, whistleblower anonymity, real-time audit triggers, new thresholds of transparency tied to actual outcomes, not optics. I'm not trying to turn this place into a temple, I said, but we're not running a casino either. Dane, ever the prosecutor, gave me a nod. The infection was slow, but the response was fast. You bought us time. That word again. Bought. They all kept using it, as if this whole thing had been a transaction. They didn't realize it had been a promise. 4:22 p.m., in the courtyard, under the October sun, a small group gathered. Not staff, not press, just a handful of the oldest team members, the ones who had been here when the company still felt like a family instead of a machine. One of them, Miguel, handed me a photo. Our first product launch. We were standing in the parking lot holding prototypes in the rain. You saved it, I said. He shook his head. No, you did. He didn't mean the photo. They had been waiting for someone to remember why we started, and I finally had. 5 p.m., final meeting of the day, board wrap-up, post-transition closeout. Everyone was there, even those who had doubted me just hours ago. The chair spoke first. I've never seen a transition that fast, that stable, or that silent. Then Priya. You did it without breaking the company. That's rare. And finally, Michael. You made power look like responsibility again. I didn't need praise, but I took the moment in, because this wasn't just about me. It was about reclaiming space for everyone who'd ever been told to be less, to wait, to stay quiet until asked. And I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. 5:18 p.m., the vote passed unanimously. All transition steps completed. Andrew's name removed from executive history, compliance records sealed, litigation underway. And just before the meeting closed, I asked to add one final note to the record. Control is not about power. It's about protection. Then I signed my name. Once. Cleanly. No flourish, no symbolism. Just truth. On paper. Where it belongs. Ayur. PM, I was the last one left in the boardroom. The lights above dimmed automatically, trying to hint that it was time to go. But I wasn't ready. Not because of grief or nostalgia, but because I finally had space to feel what had been buried under adrenaline and restraint. I stood where Andrew used to sit. Same chair, same view, but none of the noise. The silence wasn't awkward now. It was earned. And then the phone buzzed at private line, unknown number. 6:05 p.m. I picked up. The voice was low, worn, familiar. Did you really mean it? Pause. That this wasn't personal? Andrew. My jaw clenched, but I didn't raise my voice. There's a difference between accountability and vengeance, I said. What happened to you was structural. He scoffed, not out of amusement, but defense. You humiliated me. No, I replied calmly. You did that. I just documented it. There was a pause. Then something strange. I underestimated you because I thought you were like me. I leaned against the polished table, unsure whether that was meant as an insult or a confession. But you were smarter, he added. You waited. I would have gone for blood. You went for the paperwork. He was still trying to define me through his lens, and that's why he lost. 6:12 p.m. The call ended. Not with an apology, not with forgiveness, just a click. A man finally understanding he'd been played, not with deception, but with truth. I didn't feel triumphant, but I did feel free. 6:30 p.m. I walked through the building, alone this time. From floor to floor, empty desks glowing with after-hours light, screensavers bouncing in rhythm like quiet applause. I saw my reflection in the glass, tired, steady, unshaken. I didn't look powerful. I looked clear. On the 12th floor, I stopped. There was a framed mission statement, dusty, outdated, forgotten. I pulled it down and placed it gently on the floor. Time for a new one. 7:00 p.m. I returned to my office. The real one now, still bare. No personal artifacts, no framed accolades, just clean surfaces and open tabs. And one unopened envelope on my desk, handwritten, no return address. Inside, a note, one sentence. She remembered every detail. He didn't remember who she was. No name, no signature, just the truth. And I knew, without question, who sent it. Someone who'd once been ignored, passed over, spoken over. Someone who had watched it all unfold and finally exhaled. 7:08 p.m. The sunset hit the far windows, and for the first time in a long while, I saw color on these walls. Not just design, meaning. Control isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It signs documents at 8:03 and redefines the room by 8:17. This wasn't just about ownership on paper. It was about reclaiming the meaning of power and making sure no one like him, or anyone like him, ever confused fear with leadership again. PM, I didn't plan to return to the 38th floor that evening, but something pulled me back. Not ghosts, not guilt, just closure. The automatic lights blinked on as I stepped into the corridor. Everything was still. The receptionist's desk, empty. The hum of server stacks behind sealed glass, steady, dependable. This is where I was fired. This is where I rose. It looked the same, but nothing about it was. I stood outside Andrew's old office, now vacant. The door still had his name on it. An oversight, or perhaps a final echo. I opened it. There, on the desk, was something I didn't expect. 8:03 p.m., a notebook, black, soft leather, handwritten tabs, Andrew's. It hadn't been confiscated. It hadn't been reviewed. Probably considered personal property, but he'd left it. And curiosity is a dangerous fuel. I sat. Opened it. Most of it was mundane. Notes, numbers, useless observations. But about halfway through, things changed. The handwriting got tighter. The tone, defensive. They don't get it. She's good, yes, but she doesn't have the edge. I need to make the board uncomfortable with her. Start phase out. Use HR to trigger. And then, a bullet point underlined twice. Her shares can't outweigh my presence if she doesn't use them. He had bet everything on my silence, and lost because I finally spoke. 8:17 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the board meeting began. I looked out the same window he'd once stared from. Not into the skyline, but into himself. Andrew had always needed the view, I just needed the structure. The difference between us? He performed power. I documented it. He weaponized fear. I aligned voting rights. He assumed I'd blink. I signed instead. 8:31 p.m., I wrote a single email. Subject: New protocol proposal. Preventative structural safeguards. It contained 3 items. Ownership % thresholds will trigger automatic governance reviews every fiscal year. Board meeting transcripts must be audited independently and stored under legal oversight. No CEO may oversee HR without direct counter-signature from compliance. Not dramatic, not flashy, but strong enough to keep the next Andrew from ever thinking it was easy. I didn't ask permission to send it. I CC'd the chair and pressed send, 9 bots p.m. I left the notebook where I found it. Andrew's name would fade from the walls, the records, the future. But the damage he caused would remain in memory, as blueprint, as warning, as scar. You don't lead a company by accident. You build your way in, brick by policy, clause by clause, decision by decision. And if you're careful, if you play the long game, you can change more than your title. You can change what leadership means. 4:47 p.m., the city looked different from up here at night. Not bigger, not smaller, just slower, as if the skyscrapers themselves were catching their breath. Inside the office, only one light remained, mine. The others had blinked out floor by floor, department by department, one team at a time heading home, unaware that their workplace had quietly shifted on its axis. No announcement, no press release, just change, the kind that sticks. I sat with a mug of chamomile tea, no coffee, no adrenaline, just the calm after the storm I refused to call a battle. And then I opened the last document of the day. Final shareholder update, ownership summary, control disclosure. I scanned the names, the breakdown, the new clarity of lines that had once been manipulated into fog. Under majority control holder, one name now stood alone, mine, but it didn't shout. It sat there, printed in black ink as quiet as truth, and beneath it, a note from the chair. This is what stability looks like. 10:03 p.m., I walked the long hall toward the elevator, the same one where I'd stood that morning. Fired. 15 hours. That's all it had taken to reshape a company's trajectory. But in reality, it had taken 14 years of being overlooked, of being doubted, of choosing patience over ego, of building instead of posturing. In the end, no one saw the control shift happen, because when power moves through silence, it doesn't need to knock. 10:08 p.m., security held the door open as I stepped out into the empty lobby. The badge still worked. The smiles were real. Good night, Ms. Hall. Good night, James. I passed the plaque by the entrance, etched with the company's original mission, to innovate with trust. It used to make me roll my eyes. Now it made me pause, because trust, the real kind, had finally come back. And next time someone reads that plaque, it will mean something again. 10:21 p.m. At home, I placed the red folder in the fireproof safe, not to protect myself, to protect the system that finally worked. On top of it, I laid something new, a draft. Ethics as strategy, the ownership mindset. A book? Maybe. A guide? Definitely. For every woman who's ever sat in a glass room knowing she built the floor under everyone else's feet. For every builder, not just every boss. 10:45 p.m., one last email came in. Subject: Final voting rights certification confirmed. I smiled, not because I had won, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Everything was finally documented. Ownership is not about majority, it's about responsibility. And I had signed every line without flinching. 11 p.m., before going to bed, I wrote a sentence on a sticky note and placed it beside the front door. Not for motivation, for memory. They tried to fire me, I rewrote the company instead. The end.